Well, all right, I guess we'll go ahead and get started. I hope everybody had their coffee this morning since we're here to talk about the ever exciting topic of FISMA. I see I've drawn a very large crowd, but it's all right. We're against solid competition. When someone's dropping some tool and CTF is going on, I'm happy to have some people that want to hear me talk about the pros and cons of FISMA. And I'm going to try to keep this exciting, a little bit interactive. I've studied up on all the different security presentations that have been given at the various conferences, and I think I have a winning formula to keep your attention. You know, some good content, some funny jokes, and then funny pictures of animals. It seems to be the winning combination. So this is an overview of what we're going to cover today. Just really briefly, we'll talk about who we are, talk about why this talk, go into a little bit about FISMA 101. But before I get started, just since we're a small audience here, just a raise of hands. How many of you deal with FISMA on a day-to-day basis? Okay. How many have no idea what FISMA is? Who can spell FISMA? So we'll go about some of the good points of FISMA, some of the bad points about FISMA. Andrew's going to talk about, from an organizational perspective, how the challenges he's had to have with implementing technology and security into his organization in order to comply with FISMA standards. And we'll talk a little bit from an assessment point of view, just to give you an overview of what goes on in a typical FISMA assessment. Who we are, real quickly, Center International. This is my company. Based out of Northern Virginia. We do a lot of FISMA work, but just real quick, my passion is not FISMA. It's really in the iGaming sector. So if you're really interested in that, I would love to speak to you about online gambling, and we're always looking to hire people, both on the FISMA side, but also on the technical side that can do web app, reverse engineering, security code reviews, et cetera, et cetera. So here's our first picture of our funny animal. We're going to start off slow with just a cat. Typical disclaimer, these are our own views. Do not express the views of, I guess, our company, my company. You know, we like to do FISMA work, I guess, and we still may want to keep on doing that for at least the next couple of years. So I'm going to try not to, excuse me? FISMA does pay the bills, but we'll talk a little bit about that as well. It does not pay it as well as it used to pay the bills. This is me, CTO of Senate International. I do know more about FISMA and CNA than I tend to like to admit. You know, if you've done this type of work, I'm sure you've got drawn into these conversations about what control does this vulnerability map up to? Is it CM6? Is it CM7? You know, and I can't tell you how many hours I've wasted arguing with people about that. In my mind, it's really not important. The important thing is that you've discovered a vulnerability, you've mapped it back to a specific control. But we'll talk about some of those. You know, and if you want to give me a follow on Twitter, I appreciate it. I mainly tweet about security issues and online gambling. So then we have Andrew here. Say a few words, Andrew.
Hi, my name is Andrew Du. My background is a little bit different than Gus's. I'm actually a former software developer. So I'll be sort of giving you an overview from the implementer's perspective on what it took to certify a federal application over shared infrastructure. So it's a little bit more intricate than it sounds. So we had to basically certify a major application over not only shared infrastructure, but actually having to deal with a mixed code base, nested applications, and so on. So it's my best advice, and if you're encountered with something like that, is just to have a lot of faith and don't be afraid.
All right, thanks, Andrew. And Andrew's going to touch into some of those concepts that he talked about during his portion of it. So why this talk? No one's from the Department of Commerce here, right? Okay, good. I'm not going, this is really not going to be a Jack Daniels get up here and bash on PCI or some regulatory standard talk. At least I hope not. Because I do think, and we'll talk about FISMA's good points, I think it does have a lot of good points. There's some negative points as well, and we'll touch on those. But really, this third bullet I think is important, because even if you're not directly dealing with FISMA right now, you might be down the road. And just to give you an example, I just got a call on the drive down here yesterday from one of our partners who's a QSA, and one of his customers has to deal with FISMA requirements for whatever reason, and he knew nothing about it. He was like, "Was that the 853 thing?" I'm like, "Yeah, we can probably help you there." So even if you don't necessarily deal with it right now, don't necessarily directly work for the federal government, you might be like Andrew down the road where your organization company eventually ends up hosting a federal system and then has to comply with FISMA. And we just want you to know some of the pros and cons on how to quote unquote defend against FISMA. So what is FISMA? Besides being a unicorn, I've read that you have to put unicorns in presentations because it makes it funny sometimes. But so FISMA, a brief history of it. I'm sure most of you are aware of at least heard of it and what FISMA is, but the core piece dates back to 2002 with the Federal Information Security Management Act, and that really defined the state of FISMA as we know it now. Of course, before then, you had OMB Circular A130 back in 1985, and it was updated a couple times, which really started this whole mess and really started the term certification accreditation and causing government systems to have to go through this 3-year cycle and become accredited to operate. And I'm going to use the term certification accreditation throughout this presentation, though a lot of times now NIST likes you to call it system assessment authorization, SANA versus CNA, but I like CNA better for right now. And of course, NIST was given authority to establish these guidelines that we all know of, these 800 series of documents, which give you guidance in various areas on how to implement FISMA and the certification accreditation process. And of course, you can go to the NIST site and you can download those. And of course, just real quick, there's a difference between Phipps and special publications if you're not aware. Phipps are, of course, mandatory. You have to follow those. Special publications, the 800 series, are guidance. And we'll touch on a couple of these 800 series documentations as they relate to the certification accreditation process. But just so you know, even if you're not dealing with FISMA, NIST has some really good guidance on their site. For example, we recently had to do an assessment on a random number generator for one of our gaming clients, and NIST has, a 800 series document that talks about how to go about assessing that, even has a tool suite that you can use in order to do that. So they have more than just certification accreditation documentation up there that you may find useful. Of course, FISMA is not the only compliance standard that we have to deal with. We mentioned PCI. What are some other standards across the industry? Just shout them out. Common criteria. What about banking industry? PCI, exactly. There's lots out there. HIPAA, SOX, ISO, GLB. You have all these different standards and compliance regulations. What's different about these, really? Have you ever closely looked from one regulation to the other regulation? There's really not a lot of difference, in my opinion. You probably may not be able to see this very well, but it was just a crosswalk between PCI and the 853 series. In my opinion, security is security, compliance is compliance. A lot of times you'll see all these different standards, and they may differ slightly between the industry that you're in, but they all have a fundamental same components of access control, auditing, authorization, configuration management. So really, if you have an organization, like in this case, my customer who is PCI certified, in a lot of cases, they're doing a lot of the same things that they need to be FISMA certified. You just need to go about and test it properly and document the process properly. So the current state of FISMA, I listed what I believe are some of the core NIST special publications out there, and we'll touch on just a couple of these. We're not going to talk on all these. You can look at them at your own leisure if you're not familiar with them. But these are basically the building blocks of a certification accreditation process when you get into the various publications like 837, where you have a risk management framework, and 853, which tells you which security controls need to be in place. So there's a lot of good information in these documents that you can go through and learn what you need in order to successfully implement a FISMA program. In my opinion, I mentioned 837 in the risk management framework process, and this is Rev 1, which was released in no, not 2000, 2010. And this sort of fundamentally changed the process of certification or accreditation to what it was prior to Rev 1, where you have this risk management framework. And if you look at it, this all sort of makes sense from a security perspective, but I guess it was, pretty revolutionary, or they thought it was, to introduce it. So now you have sort of a different way to think about it, but this is really the way that a mature security organization should be operating anyways. It's not rocket science to us, especially the part about the ongoing security monitoring, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But 837 is really the gospel or Bible that you want to follow when going through this process. And of course, in my opinion, one of the most critical components is 853. We all know this. This gives you the list of security controls that need to be placed by family. So you have your management, operational, and technical controls. And if you look at these, compare them to PCI, compare them to another security standard regulation, I think you're going to see a lot of overlap. I even compared some of the gaming standards that were released by Nevada Gaming Commission to FISMA, and quite honestly, FISMA is doing a better job than they were doing with their standards. They could borrow and learn some from what NIST has come up with. And you may have noticed one of those special publications, 800-137, was dealing with continuous monitoring. And just like the other buzzwords that we hear all the time at the security conferences, APT, big data, et cetera, I think continuous monitoring is another one of these buzzwords that gets thrown around, and that this is going to solve all our problems. Now we don't have to do the 3-year accreditation cycle. We're going to be doing continuous monitoring. And really, if you look at this in detail and how different organizations, agencies are attempting to implement continuous monitoring, they're really not getting the complete picture of it. It's really focusing on those easy components to implement, which are some of those technical standards. When we talk about SCAP, we'll see some of that as far as the technical scanning, the CVE, CPE stuff, and getting that data submitted typically to DHS through their cyberscope. But what I find interesting is that now every single vendor, be it Tenable, application security, even core impact with core security, they all have some type of continuous monitoring slant on their product, because they realize that sells in the federal government, and that's what they're trying to show, how they can help you comply with continuous monitoring. But obviously, I think continuous monitoring is something that needs to be in place and should be in place, and everybody should be doing, but it's not going to solve all our problems from a certification accreditation standpoint. So hopefully that was a quick, just brief overview of FISMA. I think we all understand what FISMA is. I don't want to give a hour-long talk on the history of FISMA. But FISMA does have some good points, and I may have come across as a little bit negative on compliance in FISMA, but I think there is a place for it. And some of those good points are, we know, like any compliance standard, PCI, et cetera, it's better than nothing. It forces organizations that probably wouldn't implement security to actually go ahead and implement something. A lot of very smart people went into developing this guidance and documentation. If you look at this special publications, you look at all the authors and the different organizations that contributed to it. I mean, it runs the gambit from NSA to defense to commercial. I mean, you have a lot of different people who provide feedback. So, a lot smarter people than me. That has to be a good thing. It, of course, raises the level of attention within your organization. All of a sudden, now Andrew and his company, so they cared about security even before they had to deal with FISMA, but it helps drive dollars that way. So it helps with funding. It helps raises the attention and bar and visibility of security with your organization. And of course, as we saw on that one slide of 853 controls, they do cover a wide range of areas. We can argue about perhaps there's some ones that are missing that should be there, and other ones that aren't quite as important, but it is a good starting point. And there's, of course, a lot of flexibility on how you go about implementing it within your organization. So, what Andrew does for his size organization and mission purpose may not be suitable for someone else. So you can help tailor those controls and mold them into what fits for your organization. So it's not a hard and fast rule that this needs to be there. You can somewhat manipulate those controls as long as you document. Which is one of the problems, all this documentation that gets in with FISMA. But what is wrong with FISMA? It's just that. It's just a starting point. I mean, if you go just to comply with FISMA, you still can be insecure. We know that, just like we see plenty of PCI companies that have been certified that suffer credit breaches. So it is just that, just a starting point. Organizations comply with FISMA for the wrong reasons, going on with the first bullet there, just a checkbox. And this sort of goes back to the point where it pays the bills, because unfortunately, in my experience, and we do a lot of FISMA CNA work, and I'm trying to do less of it because I don't find it exciting, and I don't think there's a big future in it from a service provider standpoint. It's become a commodity. Organizations just want to check boxes now because they've begun to realize that this is a joke in its current incarnation, and that they just need to keep their scorecard green. So if I can get someone that knows how to check boxes and dot I's and cross T's, I'd rather pay them a lower amount of money than someone that really knows security to come in and do a holistic approach. So unfortunately, some organizations are complying with it for the wrong reason. These controls, while they're well written and documented, they're very easy to confuse and misinterpret. I mean, I'm not sure how many people have looked at all the different control enhancements that have to be in place for like a moderate or a high system, and you get into all the different sub-bullets for a particular control. But it can be confusing, and that's really why you need some skilled personnel who understand it to help implement it correctly. Sometimes it does focus money attention on the wrong security areas. If you have a vendor who's providing certification accreditation services, and they focus on a lot of non-technical, maybe management control areas, and you have a long list of POAM findings, plans of actions and milestones that you need to fix, funding may get diverted to those where you might have gaping holes in your application, like from a security code perspective, that now you don't have funding to look at because you have to close these POAM items. And it of course has become somewhat of a paper trail. I don't think anybody can argue with that statement. So we talked a little bit about what the mistakes are, but I want to look at some of the, in my opinion, what some of the top 10 mistakes are. And from those of you who have implemented FISMA or how to do assessments or write system security plans, just shout out a couple of what you think some of the top mistakes are. Besides being a paperwork drill, any mistakes that you've seen made throughout the course of doing this type of work?
System categorizations, not dependent on the information, but how much they're willing to spend.
Perfect. Yep, I actually have system categorization in there as a mistake. Want somebody else? Okay. We'll go through, and I'm sure you're thinking of some of the ones. This is one of the ones I see all the time. Copying the control requirements and then restating them as your compliance statement. I can't tell you how many times I've seen this. It's because people are lazy or they just don't understand. So basically, for those of you, I think everybody can pretty much see this, but they just restate the information statement, the compliance statement. The criteria is the information system enforces approved authorizations for logical access to the system in accordance with applicable policy, whatever that means, and the implementation method is the redacted system enforces approved authorizations for logical access to the system in accordance with applicable policy. It tells you nothing. So this is one of the biggest mistakes I see, and sometimes it's not this bad, but not adequately describing how you're implementing that security control in your system security plan. If you don't adequately describe it, there's no way for an independent third party to come and assess that control according to how you implemented it. They basically just have to generically test against this the criteria, and at the same time fail you to PL2 for system security plan because your system security plan is not adequate or at the right level. So in my opinion, this is something that we see a lot. Maybe it comes down to cost when we get to this budget issue as far as companies looking and government looking to spend less and less money on this. If this system still gets passed, who cares if it has a incorrect compliance statement? They should, but in my experience, we see several like this. Mistake number 2, inheriting controls that you really can't, or having controls listed as common when they are really hybrid. And just real quick, not to bore everybody, because people discuss common versus inherited, and get confused and argue about what's the difference. But basically, in the concept of certification accreditation, you can inherit controls from another system. So if I'm a major application, I sit on a GSS, I really shouldn't be caring about the operating system controls or awareness training or physical security. I inherit those from another system. But what you see sometimes is you see systems like this Where here, SI10 dealing with data information validation and data input, and they're saying that this is a major application that is inheriting this control. There's no way it inherits this control. This is a web application that you're entering in information into it. So people try to inherit controls where they really shouldn't, or say controls are common just so they don't have to discuss the implementation status, which of course when it comes to security, you're really not doing your system justice. So that's another common mistake that we do see. Incorrect security categorizations. Everybody thinks their system is a high because they think at least initially, oh, my system, yeah, it's really important. I'm important. It's a high. But until they realize how much time and money they need to invest in actually implementing all the controls of a high security category system versus a moderate, and it's a big difference. And of course, sometimes you have the opposite of, oh, yeah, so what? I have PII and credit card information, but I'm a low. Only 10 people in my organization use it or something like that. And but if you do your data categorization correctly using Phipps 109 and 860, it's very clear where your system should fall. And of course, you can tailor that based on need, but you should at least be following that initially. And that's one of the mistakes that we very often see, and we counsel our clients to recategorize your system. If we don't think it should be a high, relook at that. But oftentimes, they don't want to make changes. Incorrect system boundaries is another. You really just sort of like PCI. PCI's got a habit of, we sort of scope only those systems that deal with the credit card transactions into the PCI boundary to make it as small as possible, so you don't have to waste as much time and money investing on your PCI. It's somewhat the same theory with FISMA. And where I really see this problem is typically not in government organizations that host their own systems. So oftentimes we do, because they end up lumping GSS components in with their major application when it really should be separate. But at commercial organizations like Andrews, where they have to host a government-owned system, it's on their network. How do you draw that boundary so you isolate it from the rest of their corporate network, from their other clients that may not have to show FISMA compliance? It gets, you have to describe that accurately in your system security plan, and also technically you have to have isolation so you don't have to worry about testing other components that you don't want to or need to. The fifth mistake, not keeping up to date with the documentation. And you're supposed to update this on, they say, an annual basis. It really should be more often than that, because if you don't, you run into the problem, like I've seen. We go through to do a recertification of a system, and we're doing, say, the contingency plan testing portion, and we're going through the tabletop test. And they're like, well, we don't really have that alternate processing site anymore. We moved to another one. Well, why isn't your documentation updated? Not just one example, but if you're not updating your documentation on a regular basis, it's going to cause problems down the road. And unfortunately, everyone does not like documentation. We know that. Time is a sixth mistake. Waiting too long to start the process. This is both from the organization waiting. They know their system ATO expires in 6 months, but they wait till a month till it expires, and it's like, oh gosh, I need to get the system recertified. Obviously corners are going to be cut, mistakes are going to be made, and it also applies to the integrators who are designing systems that are going to have to be FISMA compliant, not integrating those security controls, those FISMA controls, early into the SDLC process so they get implemented correctly from the start. So it's at both places. The seventh mistake, not having enough skilled personnel. This is for doing the initiation phase of a documentation, developing your system security plan, initial risk assessment, CP, et cetera, and also the people who are doing the assessments, which I think directly relates to the fact that certification and accreditation has become a commodity. If it's so competitive to win contracts now, organizations are going to cut their prices, and to cut their prices, they can't have some OSCP coming in to do the testing portion of penetration tests. They're going to have somebody just running Nessus, against a web application and say, hey, I did my penetration testing. So it goes both ways, both on the side of developing the documentation and also doing the testing. You need to have both if it's done correctly. The eighth, making the mistake that just because you have an ATO, your system is secure. This, don't even need to say anything more about this, but I can't tell you how many times I've heard it, when we're trying to maybe sell additional services or provide some additional function. They're like, no, well, my system, it's secure. It has an ATO, Oh, I'm PCI certified. I'm secure. We don't need to do that type of testing. Usually the security folks that you deal with understand that this is not the case, but unfortunately management still needs to be educated. Another buzzword with cloud computing, moving to the cloud is going to solve all our problems, It's going to solve everything from, every security issue to your CNA issues to your performance issues. And I think this is a big myth. And, with FedRAMP is trying to solve some of this process. And yes, you can move your applications to the cloud. You're still going to have certain components that you're responsible for, even if you move it to a system that is FedRAMP certified. And we're starting to get more CSPs that are FedRAMP certified. I just saw Amazon just got theirs. So we're moving in that right direction. And it is helpful that you don't have to do as much work, but you're still going to have to ensure that your piece that you're responsible for is there. And of course, the last mistake, similar to paperwork drill, is treating the CNA process such as building a Potemkin village. And for those of you who haven't heard the term Potemkin village, it dates back to the late 1700s with Catherine the Great in Russia, and she was doing a visit, and her prime minister, Potemkin, just built, basically a facade of walls along the river. So when she cruised on their boat there, it looked like a very prosperous, village, when really it was just, a bunch of walls. And I think that is a similar process, that takes place in certification and accreditation. You just have people building these nice fancy system security plans and doing the testing, but where's the meat to it? How are they really complying with security? In a lot of cases, they're not. And I'm going to turn it over to Andrew right now so he can give some examples from his organization on how they went about and implemented security. He'll touch on some things from SDLC process and some lessons learned from his experience.
All right, hope to make this interesting for you. So I wanted to give you something to take away from this, and without boring you on governance. I guess even whether you're, so there's probably all sorts of widespread demographic in here, but whether you're your company is or your agency is about to host something, a federal application in the future, whether you're doing some sort of reauthorization or whatever it might be, it's really not that bad. I mean, I know it's in my case, having to segment out a legacy application that's a sort of every software development company, every custom software development company runs into this. It's just the growth of the company. You start small and you scale up. One of the things to not be shocked about when you start your CNA process and running SSP is don't actually seriously don't freak out. You don't need, so for instance, you don't need to buy an overcapacity SIM for your company that will break the bank. It's really running a business. It's running a little miniature business. You have to stay profitable. You scale your controls correctly, but don't omit it entirely. So don't skip static application testing entirely. Do it, but then start with open source tools or something. Don't skip entirely. Scale it correctly. So with that, I'll start with some examples of how you can actually really comply. Some of these are specific to my scenario, so feel free to stop and ask questions anytime. This is actually a lot of stuff. For my slides are kind of dense, so each one of these it can go on with a little bit of sprawl. So I'll just start at the top. So first of all, if you have a parent agency to start with that you're inheriting from, that might be able to give you baselines as a start. Usually, I hate to say usually, but it's typically if you are inheriting controls from a parent agency, they're going to be way off the bat. It's just going to be some. It's a place to start. I wouldn't just do that and be done with it. I just want to also stress that you want to be realistic about this. Again, it is like running a business. You don't want to go overboard, and you want to stay compliant. You don't want to just be compliant. You want to manage risk, which turns to the bottom line, dollars. The next thing is, of course, contracts. If you have a written contract that you're meeting for whatever services you're offering, your Phipps 199 impact level might be predetermined, so that makes things a lot easier for you. Hopefully, it's just not all high, but if it is high, then you're right. This is something to fall back on. But of course, if it's contract written, then it's tied to federal dollars, and you really don't have a choice. You might have written in SLAs. You might have to comply with HIPAA. You might have incentives to go with HL7. I'm not sure if anyone's here and having to work with that. Next one is, it's nice to have a periodic internal security certification program. What I mean by that is, realistically, you want a way to be able to inject security throughout the organization. You don't want, you're not just, security isn't some add-on service that you consult periodically when something needs to look like it's safe for production. It's something that should be at the organizational level, so this ties to hopefully a sound organizational security program that is adopted and accepted by all the directors and implemented throughout the organization as a whole, and not just for IT, or for instance. So the internal security certs, there's a couple ways to do that. So if anyone's technical, or I don't know, so what you can basically do is you can write some scripts, have it automatically discover and audit your system engineers that way, or you can say, for instance, write it into your deployment program that you'll have to establish create a quarterly reassessment program that you must rerun these rerun a set scripts or something. Anyway, so next one, PHI assessments, data usage agreements. You might have you might interact with other agencies. So there's in my case we do. So you might want to look into any kind of information usage agreements you might have with them, and any kind of deliverables you might have to meet with those also. So this is the next one is so separating levels so partitioning your system. This is something that if you are a software developer, I don't know if anyone's here. So system separation is critical. It's something that really has to start from the bottom up. Going in afterwards is not easy. It's not just separating the major. It's not just separating the application, the code, the servers. It's really it's really best from the ground up, from the network infrastructure, servers, the application, and also within, if you are architecting an application, the layers within the application and into the data tier, if it applies that far. Especially with virtualization, I've seen it's pretty easy from a cost perspective to say, let's buy one mega virtualization host and throw it all on there. That's not good. And so next, a review of externally authenticated resources. So periodically, I don't know if I wish I could talk about more. And there's some things some really interesting things, but I probably can't share. If you have threats periodically, you might want to periodically, seriously just identify the types of externally authenticated content you have exposed on the perimeter. So just anything, basically an inventory of any place that's basically an authenticated attack surface. I mean, this sounds like common sense, but it's not really done often for time, resource permitting, and for whatever other reasons. Corporate security policy is very important. Everyone has hopefully you have a corporate security policy. but it's basically a fallback mechanism for enforcement. Well, it kind of ties into your illegally enforceable rules of behavior. If you ever have to execute legal action for some kind of action. Risk-based decisions. So NIST is so the NIST FISMA frameworks. Even if you're not working with federal systems, they're not yet, or it's actually it's the result of years of continuous work, of continuous improvement. It's a lot of there's documentation. There's a NIST guideline, special publication for everything. It is and not only is there a document for everything, but there's versions of that for everything. So it's a lot of collective work that, having a, so back to, sorry, I was on risk-based decisions. Having a way to track, track and approve, assign ownership for exempted, accepted risks. For instance, I was, if you have, too often, there's legacy or there's firewalls with rules, with comments that that rules that no one has any idea what it does. So as a starting point, I would probably I wrote a custom application that basically creates an approval process within the organization that ties into, it basically creates and tracks, it creates work it tracks work for the organization, but it's based off of it's based off of a risk acceptance process that ties to informed directors automatically, and in addition to that, it's we've incorporated a scoring system internally so that it ties into a vulnerability ranking system. So you can do something similar to that. But definitely have some place to identify and track those risks so that they're not just lost somewhere, and those firewall rules aren't just sitting there aging. I guess I'm going to keep going because anyway. I'm going to run through this probably faster than I intended. So budgeting, definitely have an allocated set of budgeting. And of course, that's critical for any federal system. That's kind of a given. Have an incident response team. This is one, so have a prototyping lab. This is not one that you might think about, but and of course, so definitely, anywhere I go, I would recommend having a prototyping lab for authorizing technologies, because so many of the deficiencies, many vulnerabilities, so many times when writing baselines and procedures, it's really you need a place to test that theory. I'm not much of a theoretical person. You really need a place to validate something before you write it in. One of the main differences between my history as a developer is that I've gone from writing code, being a code monkey, to a lot of writing procedures and documentations. But it's there for a purpose. It's there to for others to use. PMO integration, basically SDLC integration. There's more details on that later. I'll keep going. Internal risk assessment process. Basically, one of that's basically establishing. You want to be able to establish ownership for a risk for your to managers or to your underlying business units. Even better, the asset weighting, asset ranking designation. What's cool about that is once you have that in place, you can actually do what I did. I've automated it. I've actually have traceability to all NIST controls, and actually will send an email out to information security when the baseline changes and how much the score is incremented for every single change across the network, for across platforms. So you can do something similar. So once you have some standardized, you have to have some kind of baseline to start. Otherwise, you can't say something changed. Because I can keep on going forever on this because it goes into configuration management. So again, finally, building in the architecture. Zoning the architecture is critical. Wow, so I should probably really pick it up. Okay. Let's see. Any questions? Okay, I can talk to you later. The RVAsec, I mentioned this a little bit earlier. So I'm going to go over the major categories. So starting with management, at the highest level, you do want, you have to have an information security program to start. Dedicated budgeting, where that vulnerability scanning schedule. So when you're specifying your vulnerability scanning, be realistic about it. So if you're certifying a major application, an application like us, don't just include the server infrastructure. Definitely go into the application. Goes into source control, check-in policies. It's actually another dimension that is commonly missed. Let's see. I'll try to just cut it down to an overview or one per the major categories. So operational examples, baselining, disaster recovery is a big one. These are all really large items. So determining whether to load balance or to dual purpose your disaster recovery site. Media transport, this is actually a real example. Had to work on a case where a manager left a laptop on a cab in New York, had some critical sensitive information on it. The cost is astronomical when that happens. The potential loss is astronomical. So a solution, if you haven't had this happen yet, or if you think it might happen, incorporate laptops with pre-boot authentication. Let's see, SIM, okay, all right. Technical defenders. Okay, so basically just at the lowest level, the technical, these are some examples of technical controls. Anyway, okay, I'll keep going. Examples from organization. So basically a recap of the large items I mentioned previously. Risk-based approach versus compliance-only focus. Don't just focus on the wording, on making the your SSP look nice. It's real risks for the organization. It's real cost, and there should be payback. There should be value created by that. So don't just do it for the compliance part of it. Okay, let's give this one. More examples. I can talk to you more about this later, but it goes into several different layers, especially in application design, application architecture. It can get feel free to talk to me later, or I can give you advice on that. Writing documentation sucks. I think this is the last one for me. Writing documentation sucks. Yes, or maybe you might like it, whatever. But if it's not sufficiently documented, create inaccuracies to your SSP, and additionally, it could create incorrectly categorized dependencies, code, service, otherwise. Many times at a company, there's always a box, an obscure box in the corner that does something that no one really understands. I would fix that right away. All right. Gus. All right.
Thanks, Andrew. And definitely, Andrew's very good talking on one-on-one afterwards if you have some specific advice on what he's doing. He ran through that very, very quickly because he had to. First time we gave this together, so it's timing may be a little bit off. Real quick, I'll get you guys out of here in time for lunch. Don't worry, it's box lunches today, so there's not going to be a big line. Jay told me that. How do these controls get assessed? Of course, your Bible's 853A, which basically tells you how to go about doing it. It's a lot of interviews, a lot of examinations, and you see that last bullet, testing, which I think, of course, is the most important. But of course, I think it's a phase that suffers most currently in the climate there, how you actually go about testing it. Some tools that actually perform 853 compliance, and these aren't actually tools that we use for testing, but these are more GRC-related tools that organizations are using. And these are the major ones. It's supposed to automate workflow. If you've used any of these, you know they're very painful. It still takes a lot of time to do it. There's still a lot of writing that you still have to do, but these are the major players out there that we've experienced and that different government organizations use. As far as tools, SCAP, when it comes to an assessment perspective and typical scanning, you need to have a tool that is SCAP compliant, which is a protocol, has a lot of different components, CVE, CPE, OVAL, et cetera, et cetera. But good news is most all your tools are already SCAP compliant, because just like continuous monitoring, the government vendors realize they have to do this if they want to sell, so all their tools meet this protocol. From how to go about assessing management, and really a lot of the management process is a lot of interviews and examinations. And here's what we typically develop as sort of like an I&E spreadsheet where we have a control, who we need to talk to, evidence required, real fun stuff. Often assessing these are easy and straightforward, but you really have to read the control implementation statement carefully, because sometimes they have some really good writers and they'll try to make it sound like it's really implemented when it's really not. Like if you read that one closely later, you'll see that it does not really meet the requirements of continuous monitoring. Operational, one of the largest control classes, but some that definitely deal with directly impact the security of an organization. I'm thinking about configuration management and system integrity controls. During a lot of your technical scans, a lot of findings you can easily map back to either like CM6 for configuration settings or SI2 for flaw remediation. So there's still a lot of non-technical findings and operational that you'll come from your interview examination phase. You can see these, real, important, but maybe not the most interesting to us that like to actually perform security testing. But this is also where at least you get to have some fun, if you like running Nmap and stuff. And, you'll see some findings here. You can probably map, back to CM7 for least functionality. I'm sure that server doesn't really need all those ports and services listening. Technical. So technical controls are typically what we find where we have the most fun assessing, but nowhere are you going to see requirements that you have to go about and, run detailed penetration testing, use tools like Metasploit or something. You're lucky sometimes if you get a NESA scan that gets run. And there's also plenty of interviews and examinations you still have to do. I'm not sure if you ever looked at AC2, for example, account management. But that control for a moderate level system has about 4 different control enhancements, like with 10 bullets each that have to be met. It takes a lot of time to actually assess if an organization is doing account management correctly and through the interview and examination process. And of course, we mentioned you get to have some fun. So, you can go through and do your web testing and find vulnerabilities like SQL injection. Yeah, so what? Just a SQL injection vulnerability. Why is this important in the context of this presentation? Well, it's because the SSP for this system says that, they do data validation and they strip out, dangerous characters, et cetera, et cetera. Well, why is this in place? And also, in this particular system, it's funny because the system had received an ATO from another government organization. So they were very surprised when we ended up finding a SQL injection vulnerability in a system that had already had an ATO granted. Just goes to show you that whole ATO does not equal secure slide from before. How can we fix FISMA? I think there's definitely, we're moving in the right direction. Awareness has already been raised. I think with all compliance standards, but even more specifically with FISMA. And we have some recent laws that have passed or executive orders. 13636 deals with critical infrastructure. There's actually the Federal Information Security Amendments Act of 2013, which passed the House and is now in the Senate, which hopes to rectify some of the problems of current FISMA. You have other organizations like SANS, who really aren't the biggest fan of a whole NIST FISMA process, if you talk to Alan Poller. And maybe other ideas. Maybe we need to require organizations that provide services on CNA, are certified. But I'm not sure if that's had much luck with the PCI industry and the whole QSAs and everything. You still get plenty of people who don't know what they're doing. So in conclusion, and I got you here right on time. So it's easy to comply with FISMA. It's harder to do it right and build real security into your organization. And I think until we move away from this paperwork mentality that affects all compliance standards, we're not going to move to real security and real increase of your overall security posture. But the good news is I think we are moving into the right direction. I think you, as people who provide FISMA services or deal with information security and compliance, that you help educate system owners, management on why real security needs to be built into the security awareness process. With that, we can move to questions, and since it's lunch, you can go to lunch or talk to me or Andrew about other questions. So thank you, everybody. and have a rest of a good con.